We are currently at 298K subs. The goal is to get to 300K by the end of this month, which would be a huge, milestone for me. 300 would definitely be nice, so every sub counts. And let's get this show on the road. Black against 1324, very strong opponent. And we're going to play, as is my officially recommended line, the Accelerated Dragon. Hopefully we get an open Sicilian. We're praying for d4, but if we don't, that's also valuable. You have to know many anti-Sicilians. Of course, there's the Rossolimo, bishop b5, and this is the first time we are facing it. So the bishop b5 is called the Rossolimo variation. You can think of it almost as the Ruy Lopez against the Sicilian. And it is the favorite choice among top players now for well over a decade. I mean, Fabiano Caruana plays the Rossolimo regularly. I myself, with the white pieces, play bishop b5 almost exclusively. I almost never go d4. And the benefit of the Rossolimo at a high level is that it offers a more positional game in contrast to the open Sicilian. And it is a very, very serious way to fight for the advantage at a high level. Now, at a lower level, people often play bishop b5 without really understanding why they're playing it. They just sometimes think that they're playing with the Ruy Lopez and they don't fully understand the difference. Now, since we are Accelerated Dragon players in the speedrun, we are going to play the move g6 here. There are two principal ways to play the Rossolimo with black. g6 is one move, and as many in the chat are indicating, the other is e6. So for people who play, let's say, the Powelson, or who play the Taimanov, e6 is a more sensible choice. But for Accelerated Dragon players, it is more consistent to fianchetto your bishop. And in this position, once again, there is a choice between bc and dc. And if you think back all the way to our initial speedrun, you might remember a couple of games where we faced the Rossolimo. And you might remember that the main move for black is actually to play d takes c6, to capture away from the center. And that is what we're going to do right now, to capture away from the center. But looking at DC just visually, you should immediately begin to realize what the motivation behind taking away from the center is. There's a couple of things to notice. The first, of course, is that you're opening up the diagonal for the bishop. The second is that you're opening up a line of contact between the queen and important squares on the d file. So you are increasing your control over the center by recapturing with the d pawn. Now we complete our kingside development with bishop g7, fianchettoing the bishop. And in these types of positions, white often plays the move h3. Like the players who are familiar with Rossolimo theory end up playing h3 in order to prevent the move bishop g4. But we don't have to play bishop g4. It's not like trading the bishop for the knight is really like that good for black. It's just considered good from a positional standpoint. But we're going to play it in a much simpler way. I'm going to try to illustrate the sort of main Rossolimo ideas for black. And essentially what we're trying to do with black, first and foremost, is we're trying to set our pieces up in such a way that we fully clamp down on the center. And when you hear this word, clamp, right, clamp down, you should think very often of two pawns that are dominating, let's say, a key square or a key set of squares. So the move that you should be that should be circulating around your mind is e7, e5, upon which the bishop is kind of considered an extension of the pawn. The bishop and the pawn are one unit, and what is that one unit doing? They are controlling this very important d4 square. They're also controlling the f4 square. They're just basically controlling key squares in the center. But before we push e5, it's a good idea to carry out the following maneuver. First, we're going to start by playing knight f6, and we're going to develop our knight to f6. So this is a very flexible move. That doesn't mean that we're not going to play e5, but what you're going to see is that if white's bishop comes out to e3, our knight's going to drop back to d7, where it's going to be controlling the c5 pawn, defending the c5 pawn, and reinforcing the idea of e5. And that is why you often see players in the Rossolimo actually playing bishop g4 with black. That's why you see players playing bishop g4 with black, because the drawback of dropping the knight back to d7 is, of course, that it locks in the bishop on c8. And you might say, well, what's the problem with then fianchettoing the bishop to b7? Well, there aren't that many prospects on this other diagonal because then it'll be hemmed in by the c6 pawn. So if you want to play this like a positional pro, we first play bishop g4, we trade the bishop for the knight, then we drop the knight back to d7, we push e5, and our remaining two minor pieces are both very much involved in the process of controlling the center. Bishop takes f3, there we go. Now, we drop our knight back to d7. And the reason we play knight d7 first is that e5 immediately allows white the additional option of developing his bishop to g5 and trading the bishop off for the knight. This knight is an integral player in our control over the center. And now, finally, we sort of complete our initial central plan with a move e5. Hopefully, that has made sense. Now, our opponent is demonstrating complete knowledge of all the key ideas, which is pretty impressive. a4. White is grabbing some space on the queen side. White is grabbing some space on the queen side. Now, we want to join the party. We don't want to let white just advance this pawn to a5 and clamp down our queen side. So what should we do? How should we? Well, we should meet white at the top. What move does that entail? So b6 doesn't actually prevent white from playing a5. In fact, I would argue that b6 makes a5 even more annoying. It kind of gives some fuel to the fire. I would just play a5. Yeah, just clamp down and prevent white from making further progress on the queen side. Yeah, so as Buddy indicates in the chat, our subsequent plan in this position is to castle kingside and then push f5 and start a kingside pawn attack. Much like in a lot of openings like the King's Indian, there are a lot of openings where you have this plan of pushing the f-pawn on the king side. And that's another reason that we fianchettoed our dark-squared bishop, so that when we push f5, we don't have to worry too much about weakening our king side. Knight e2. I mean, our opponent is playing a fantastic positional game so far. We castle king side, of course. And I assume our opponent is guiding his knight toward g3 in order to prevent f5. Wow. Okay. Well, we don't give up on our plans that easily. We don't give up on our plans that easily. How can we reinforce the idea of f5? Well, ideally, you would have like a bishop that would be on e6 here. But in this case, you have to make do with what you have. So who can tell me, like, what piece can we bring to what square? And if you're watching on YouTube, try to pause and figure this out. In order to reinforce the threat of f5, we have to use the queen. We simply have to use the queen. Now, from what square could the queen prepare f5? Well, it could prepare f5 from the e6 square. So let's start with a move queen e7. Not queen c8. The problem with queen c8 is that the knight is blocking the queen's access to f5, and then moving the knight involves giving up the c5 pawn. So you'd have to additionally play b6, and then you have to move the knight away to b8. That seems to be rather cumbersome. Here, we already put our queen on e6, and we are already prepared to play f5. Could you explain queen e7 over queen e8? Well, the only reason I chose queen e7 over queen e8 is that it kept the rooks connected. That's really all there was to it. Our opponent is preparing b4. Okay, let's think about this for a second. Yeah, this is far from easy, of course. So, of course, candidate move number one is the move f5. And f5 looks very appealing indeed. It prepares a fork with f4. But the genius of our opponent's play, positioning the knight on g3 was actually very smart from our opponent's perspective, because the move f5 can actually be met with e takes f5, g takes f5, and the knight can jump out to this h5 square. And everybody should kind of understand that h5 square is rather annoying, because it pressures the bishop on g7. And if the bishop in that position drops back to h8, then there's another check on g3, so things kind of get a little bit dicey on the king side. But dicey doesn't mean insurmountable or unmanageable, and I don't think that knight h5 is a deal breaker. We've done all of this in order to play f5. I think we should follow through. We don't have much else that we can do here. Perhaps some of you noticed the move queen to b3, but then white's queen can drop back to d1. And an endgame is definitely not in black's favor here, given that we are the one with a damaged pawn structure on the king side, on the queen side. Okay, so far our opponent is playing very, very well. Knight h5 here is what I would play with white. Not an easy move at this level, but I think he's going to find it. This doesn't feel positional as black, says Eric the Red. Well, I think saying something does or does not feel positional is kind of relative. We're kind of following the prescribed method in this position. And I'm cutting some corners with black. I will fully admit that the way that I'm playing this position with black is not how we're going to play it when we're like 2000, right? I'm just trying to kind of illustrate the skeletal basic plans in the position to give you a sense of how to play. Otherwise, it's very hard to teach, these conceptual openings like the Rossolimo properly. If I kind of throw all the theory at you, then you're kind of going to get lost in the complications. Hopefully, I've managed to illustrate the general plans thus far. So what are we threatening? Well, we're threatening the move f4. That would fork the two minor pieces. Okay. So white can't just blindly follow through with his plan of b4. White has to move one of the minor pieces. Apart from f4, we also have a rather extensive assortment of improving moves. Like, for example, what are some moves that we could play to improve our position? Well, we could bring the a rook into the game with rook a to e8. And I always recommend on your opponent's turn, if the position is not overly tactical, to kind of generate these lists of general improving moves that you could play. Not only does that make your play more efficient, but it's kind of the prescribed method at a high level to think conceptually on your opponent's turn and then think more concretely on your own turn. I think that's a pretty good way to apportion the thinking time. Bishop to d2. So there's a couple of ways to handle this position. We could play rook a to e8, but there is a move here that I actually really like, and it's a move that I think not a lot of players would necessarily look at instinctually. It's a move that offers a queen trade. I'll give you a pretty big hint. And the point of this move isn't just to offer the queen trade, it's to fix the queenside pawn structure and to knock off white's very nastily placed queen on f3. This queen on f3 is really well placed for white because it halts the progress of our kingside pawns. And it aims at the queen side. So if white ever plays the move b4, it can combine with the rook to exert pressure on our queen side. So the move I have my eye on is actually queen e6 to d5. So we have a positional threat of taking white's queen and ruining white's kingside pawn structure. Not the end of the world for white, but still a pretty big gain if we're playing black. If white plays knight takes f5, that fails tactically, and you should see that. Then we take the queen on f3. White has an intermediate check on e7. But in that position, who can tell me which way we go with our king? So in that position, do we go to h8 or do we have a different square? Simple calculation, just testing your visualization. Yeah, king f7, right? That's a classic method where then white has to waste the tempo taking back our queen, and the king takes the knight on e7. We are up a piece. So knight takes f5, queen takes f3, g takes f3, rook takes f5, wins the piece. If white accedes to the queen trade, then we get a massive pawn center. We get 4 pawns on the 4th rank. And in that situation, we'll be prepared to continue steamrolling white with e4. So we're posing a rather difficult decision to white, and we're improving the placement of our own queen. So it's a rather nasty positional move to face, I think, for white. Hopefully that explanation made sense. Mamba on Discord asks, doesn't queen takes d5 create a hole on b5? It does. I can't argue with that. But what can possibly occupy that hole? Can you envision a future where the white knight on g3 gets to b5? Perhaps, but that's going to take the knight at least 4 or 5 moves, and that's an eternity in a chess game. Our gains are a lot more immediate than the hole on b5. And remember, almost everything's going to have some drawback. You're going to be able to look at almost every move and say, well, this creates a hole, this creates a weakness. Queen e2, best move, by the way, by our opponent. That's very, very strong. keeping the queens on the board. Our opponent understands that that is the way to keep fighting for the advantage with white. So now we have to keep finding ways to improve our position. And I have a couple of ideas. So, of course, I think the most obvious move in the position, as many of you are indicating, is in fact rook a to e8. But that's not the only way that we could use our rooks to try to pressure the king side. Another interesting idea would be, well, if our rooks were doubled on the f file, right? Let's imagine for a second that we had rooks on f7 and f8. You might then notice that you have this idea of playing f4. Now, f4 is a positionally very risky move. Why is it so positionally risky? Because it gives up this massive square in the center for the knight. It gives up the e4 square. But if the rooks were doubled on the f file, then you would be able to push the pawn all the way to f3 and provoke massive weaknesses on white's king side. It would probably be worth it to do so. So one idea here is actually to play either rook f7 or even rook up to f6. And the reason I like a move like rook f6 is from f6, the rook could perhaps double back to g6 and put some pressure on white's g2 pawn. So that would be an interesting way to go. But conversely, the benefit of playing rook f7 is that the rook on f7 is a nice defensive piece. It's kind of protecting the bishop. It's protecting the king. And it's also protecting the b7 pawn. So I actually want to go for rook f7. If you think about it, let's not forget that white had this old idea of playing b4. White plays c4. Okay, that is music to my ears because it's kind of one move-itis. White attacks the queen, but white weakens the d3 pawn. Now this is a serious weakness. It's a backward pawn. And correspondingly, there is now a very juicy outpost that's been created on d4. And our knight on d7 is only 3 moves away from exploiting that outpost. Knight f8, knight e6, and knight d4 is going to probably come next. Where should we move the queen? Should we move it to e6? Should we move it to d6? Or should we move it up to d4 and occupy the outpost? Well, you should rule out queen d4. You shouldn't occupy outposts with a queen because it's way too vulnerable. You should drop it back to d6. This is the nicest square because you're aiming at the d3 pawn. Queen e6 would kind of step into the pin, and it would allow a nasty move like f4, which, by the way, white could play anyway. I would maybe even play f4 with white. But the queen on d6 is clearly the best of the 3 squares available to the queen. How do I see these knight moves? Well, it's not that hard, right? It's just all about charting a course. You notice the destination square, and then you just ask yourself, how do I get there in the fastest possible way? Now, we have to be careful because there's this pawn on a5, which is going to be hanging if we play rook e8 too quickly. So we should definitely consider throwing in the move b6 in order to reinforce the a5 pawn so that we don't have to worry about that headache. Of course, we could sacrifice the pawn on a5. That is not out of the question. If we can, if we're desperate, or if we believe that the importance of getting the knight, let's say, to d4 supersedes the importance of a corner pawn, then we would sacrifice a5. But I don't really see the need for that in this position. I think we have the luxury here of making sure that everything is protected. So we have a couple of candidate moves. We can play knight f8, but the problem with knight f8 is that white's going to go rook f to e1. And if we then go knight e6, we actually drop this very important pawn on e5. So we can modify our strategy a little bit. We can go knight f8, rook f e1, and then we can go knight to g6. And knight to g6 defends the pawn on e5 and also aims for the f4 square. It's not as good as the e6 square, but it's still a pretty solid defensive square for the knight. We could also take a slower approach. We could say, let's not move the knight at all yet. Let's start with the move b6. Then let's bring the rook to e8. Let's try to shore up all of our weaknesses first, and then maybe later we'll have an opportunity to get the knight around to d4. So I think all of these options make a lot of sense. I think that we should probably try to play as solidly as possible, given that our opponent is playing super well. So let's play b6, and let's play rook e8, and let's keep as many of our options open for the knight as possible. Well, doubling rooks and going f4 is no longer the appropriate idea because if you play f4, knight e4 now comes with tempo, right? So we won't really be able to shove this pawn all the way down to f3. And if you think about it, after f4, knight e4, if you have to spend a tempo moving your queen, you give white then the opportunity to play the move f3 himself and close down the possibility of us going f3. And we certainly don't want to give away the c4 square for free. Okay? So we're just making general improving moves right now. This is a stage of the game in which you shouldn't overthink it. We're just bringing pieces into the game. We're protecting our weak pawns, and we're awaiting an opportunity to make further improvements with our minor pieces. So our next move most likely is going to be rook a8 to e8 in order to reinforce the pawn on e5. And you might say, well, shouldn't we reinforce the pawn on f5? And we can. But I have a feeling that at some point, white might be likely to play a move like f4. And if he does do that, wouldn't we want to have a rook on this file? If the e file ever opens up, it's a good idea to already have a rook there so that we can fight for it. In addition, the actual reason that I play rook e8 is so that the knight is free to roam about the cabin. We could not go knight f8 here because that would blunder the pawn on e5. Whoop, that is, none of those arrows were accurate. White has 1, 2, 3 attackers, and we would have only had 2 defenders on e5. So we're adding a defender in order to be able to maneuver the knight over to g6. And the reason we'd maneuver the knight to g6 is not just so that the knight again defends e5, but rather as a destination point, as a transit point to f4, Frankfurt Airport. Yeah, one could say that we are overprotecting the e5 pawn, to use Nimzovician terms. And overprotection is just protecting something more times than is strictly necessary in order to free up pieces that are currently defending the pawn. If you're overprotecting a pawn, that means you don't need to be protecting it as many times. That means some of the pieces can go do other things. f4, played by our opponent. Okay. What we're going to do now is try to exploit a drawback of the move f4. Now, it would be very nice, wouldn't you agree, if we could reposition our f-rook to e7, if we could double rooks on the e-file. Well, that would be pretty nice because the e-file is very likely to open, but we can't do that because the pawn on f5 is going to be hanging. So which piece could we shift to what square? Yeah, and a lot of you guys are already pointing this out. Queen d6 to g6 is a nice way of simultaneously attacking the knight, which has been loosened by white's last move, and protecting the f5 pawn, making it possible for us to shift our rook to e7, which, to remind you once again, we are doing because the e-file is very likely to open up once white plays f takes e5. Now, unfortunately, there's the very annoying move knight h5, which, consistently with our opponent's level thus far, he should be well within his level. And after knight h5, I most certainly... No, he plays queen f3. Okay. So queen f3, I think, allows us to continue with our plan and play rook f to e7, doubling our rooks on the e-file. Now, as a consequence of that, we are now able to move the e-pawn. Previously, we couldn't play e takes f4 because the rook on e8 would be hanging. Now, we have at our disposal 2 possibilities. We can play e takes f4, or in some cases, we can push the pawn to e4. F takes e5. Our opponent strikes first. What should we recapture with? Well, we can reach that calculationally because if we take with the bishop, we walk into knight takes f5. And then if we take the knight in that position, white plays knight takes e7 check, winning both of our rooks. So we have to take with the knight. And the point is that if queen takes f5, the knight on g3 is dropped. And if white plays bishop takes e5, we can take back with the rook. And if white takes with the rook, we again take with our rook, and the f5 pawn is protected. Now, I realize that I've miscalculated. I think our opponent has... Wait, no. Oh, there's a beautiful detail at the end. Oh my gosh. I really hope this happens. So what I missed after rook takes e5 is that white can play rook takes e5, rook takes e5, and now rook to f1 when there is no way for us to defend the f5 pawn. But we have a beautiful tactical solution in that position. Let's see if our opponent falls for it. I mean, our opponent has not fallen for much of anything thus far. And I will admit I have gotten outplayed, more or less. I don't think we're worse if this tactical idea I have generated actually works out for us. Knight e2. No, our opponent does not fall for it. Okay. So what do we do now? Yeah, rook e3, very nice. So now I think it's a good idea for us to try to immediately claim dominance over the e-file, right? The e-file is the only open file on the board. And as I've shared many, many times before, when there is only one open file, generally speaking, you want to be the one to control that file first. So how do we do that? Well, the move queen e6 comes to mind. But if you think about it carefully, queen e6 allows white to step into f4 with tempo. And you don't want to allow tempo moves in an open position. So can we do the same thing, but without allowing a tempo move? Yeah, queen e8 is what we're going to play. Now, bishop h6 is a very sensible move that some of you are suggesting as a way to safeguard and secure the e3 square. Maybe go rook e3 next. I like bishop h6, but I think for the time being, keeping the bishop fianchettoed is a more flexible approach. I think queen e8 is a little bit more to the point. So let's see. It also poses white with a decision, and decisions are never fun, especially when one side is getting low on time. So let's see where white goes. And normally for, players in the 1300 range, these types of decisions are very difficult. Where to put the knight. And notice that if the knight moves away from e2, we have the possibility of trading off the rooks with rook e1 check. And that could be beneficial to us if we determine that the bishop is stronger than the knight in the resulting position, which we're going to have to calculate based on where white puts their knight. Knight f4. So I see immediately two candidate moves. The first is the move rook to e3, which everybody should see. That drives the queen out of f3, and it paves the way for the bishop to drop into this very nice d4 square. We're starting to make progress. The second move, and the more concrete approach to the position, is, of course, to play rook e1 check. So let's calculate rook e1 check. Rook e1 check, rook takes e1, queen takes e1 check, king h2, and then in that position, we can step into e5 with the bishop, pinning the knight. But in that position, white can unpin the knight by playing pawn to g3. And I'm just not totally convinced that black has enough to win the game in that position. So from the perspective of playing for a win, I think the way to do it is, in fact, to play rook e3, keeping the tension. Moreover, we have a really pretty tactic after queen f2. I think we can win a pawn. I'm actually not totally convinced that winning the pawn is the best that we can do there. No, queen f2 loses. Queen f2 loses. White has to find queen f1, not elementary, and our opponent blunders the queen in one move. And again, it's consistent with the pattern that we've kind of observed, which is that players can play really, really well at this level, like really, really well at this level. But the moment you start putting serious pressure and creating a lot of threats in a row, blunders are incredibly common. And I think we've seen that over and over and over again. Knight d5. Let's finish the game off in style. Obviously, do not play rook takes d3. It's never too late to blunder. I think a lot of you would play rook takes d3, missing the fork on e7. So anytime the knight is in close proximity to the king and the queen, you look very, very carefully at potential forks, and you keep the rook on the e-file. Rook e2 is a move that both is active and protects the e7 square. Yeah, I mean, excellent game by our opponent. I honestly have to say, I was pretty close to getting outplayed there. And I think he's totally legit. I mean, as was evidenced by queen takes c6. So, rook f1. Now, again, we should be careful not to play queen g6, walking into knight f4 with a fork. So we just have to sort of sidestep these potential forks. And I think the best way to do it is probably, let me think for a second, to play queen to d6, actually. Queen to d6. And the point is just to drive the queen into g3. And that is anticlimactic, but that's the speedrun for you. It's a mixed bag. I'm sure we'll get our share of thrilling finishes. This just didn't happen to be one of them, but that doesn't mean there isn't plenty to talk about in this game. There is. Queen g3 is game over. Notice that knight e7 check. The rook is still protecting that square. Knight f6 check. We play bishop takes f6. And we basically have two sources of threats here. There's the checkmate in one threat, queen takes g2. And if it's defended with knight f4, then there's the second category of mate threats on the back rank with rook e1. So there's no way to defend against both threats at the same time. And he doesn't. And we win. And we cross 1200. All right. Tough game. 33 moves. Let's analyze. So once again, this is the Rossolimo. And it is considered not even a second. It's not a sideline. It is a main line. Alongside the move d4, bishop b5 is sort of the second main line against knight c6. And that is why some players who play the accelerated dragon, they like to start with the move g6. This is actually called the hyper-accelerated dragon, but there is no free lunch. And the drawbacks of g6 greatly outweigh the benefits. So the drawback of the immediate g6 is that c3, the alapin, is actually very, very annoying against the early g6. In addition, white has d4, c takes d4, and queen takes d4, which is a whole... This is not better for white, but it's a whole nother opening that you have to know. So that's why I don't recommend g6 in the speedrun. We allow the Rossolimo, and we just learn how to play against it. So, as I mentioned, the two main moves here are e6 and g6, and the way you choose a move is based on what you play, traditionally, what you play against d4. If you play e6 or e5, or you're a Sveshnikov player, then most of the time you play e6 and vice versa. Which is not to say that accelerated dragon players are not allowed to play e6 or that you can't learn this, but I just think this is more consistent with what we normally play, if that makes sense. So g6. Bishop takes c6. Now, recently, players, including Wesley So, who recommends this in his Chessable e4 course, I myself, with white, I play a cross between the Rossolimo and the Alapin Sicilian that is recommended by Wesley, which is to castle, bishop g7, and now to play the move c3. And this has gained a lot of steam in recent years. In fact, I would say it's overtaken bishop takes c6 in popularity, this c3 line. And after knight f6, white actually usually defends the e-pawn with rook e1. You've probably seen me play e5 in blitz, which is a sideline, and it's really interesting, but it's equal. Rook e1 is a very serious attempt at an advantage. And here the main line goes castles. White occupies the center with d4. And as is so often the case, how does black usually deal with this imposing center? How does black counterstrike in the center? Yeah, this is not the Alapin. This is a completely different opening. This is the Rossolimo. So as a Sicilian player, you should remember that the move here is d5. Yeah, d5. So some of you are suggesting e5 is very awkward. e5 is very awkward. It closes down the bishop, and after d5, I think you're also likely to just lose the pawn on e5. No, this just looks... this looks awkward. Of course, if you're not comfortable playing d5, then you should play the move d6. But clearly after d6, white normally plays h3 to stop bishop g4. Here, black is slightly worse. Black is cramped. So the theoretical move is actually d5, and the idea is to carve out this very powerful square for the knight. And you might say, well, but what about the bishop? Isn't the bishop now biting on granite? And it is, and that's called a complicated position, right? Not everything is perfect. But later on in the game, another idea that you should be very familiar with when there's a pawn chain, ideally you want to attack the tip, the base of the pawn chain. But here you can't do it, right? If you compare this kind of structure, let's say to the advanced French. In the advanced French, you get the same structure, but you have the capacity of attacking d4. You do so by piling up with your pawns and your pieces. Now, fast forwarding to this position, you can't really orchestrate an effective attack on d4. So the next best thing often is to break up the tip of the pawn chain, which is not ideal, but often opens up the piece. And that's why, as many of you are pointing out, one of black's main ideas in this position is indeed to push the f-pawn to f6. Okay? Which is not to say that queen b6 is not a common move in this position as well. It most certainly is. But f6 happens frequently as well. Anyways, you can analyze this on your own. I'm sure we'll probably get this again later on in the speedrun. In this game, white plays the traditional line, which is to trade on c6 and to push the pawn to d3. Okay, so d3 is played. We played bishop g7, knight c3, and knight to f6. Now, checking reference, I can see that e5 immediately is also considered a viable continuation, and then developing the knight to e7. But the problem is that knight on e7 is heavily restricted by the pawn on e4. Robert Hess likes to point this out in his commentaries. For example, let's say white castles and black plays knight e7. What I don't like about this position is that the knight just has no prospect. It's dominated by the pawn on e4. So that's why I wanted to reposition the knight on a slightly better square, the d7 square. But the main reason you play DC rather than BC, as I explained after the game, BC is a totally viable alternative. There is a ton of theory in BC as well. So again, you should always take my opening recommendations with a grain of salt, and you should not assume that the alternative move is somehow a mistake. In most cases, in the first 10, 12 moves, it's just an alternative. But DC opens up the light squared bishop and increases our control over key central squares by opening up the d file for our queen. So d3, bishop g7, knight c3. We decided on knight f6, which is also a very popular move. Castles. And we take the opportunity to bring the bishop out to g4. That is why most grandmasters in this position play the move h3 to keep this bishop relatively confined. And black still goes knight d7. That is still the main line. White normally develops the bishop. Black plays e5, and this position has occurred thousands of times. White is considered to be a smidge better here, but it's just a very strategically complex game. Just a very strategically complex game. White plays queen d2 a lot of the time to prepare bishop h6. Now, black prevents bishop h6 by pushing the pawn up to h6. Castles kingside. Black often plays b6 here. And yeah, there are hundreds of games all throughout these lines. And one of white's main ideas in this position is actually to prepare the f-pawn, the f4 pawn break. You often see white driving the knight back, let's say knight h2, and then quickly trying to push f4 to open up the king side and then attack on the king side, exploiting the fact that black cannot easily castle kingside or risk dropping the pawn on h6. And what you will often see is that the knight from d7, who can remind me what is the knight's sort of ideal maneuver from this position? And I mentioned this during our game. This is also very pertinent in this position. The knight from d7 travels to Frankfurt Airport, knight f8, and then from f8 maneuvers to e6 with the dual purpose of controlling the f4 square and discouraging white from playing f4. That is why most people play f4 here, while it's not too late. But after ef, bishop f4, knight e6, the secondary idea is to control this all-important d4 square, which can be used as an outpost for the knight. You can play knight d4 on the very next move, and there are still dozens of games in this position. So something like this constitutes the sort of traditional main line of the Rossolimo, but here our opponent castles, allowing us to get rid of this bishop so that it doesn't constitute a headache a little bit later in the middle game. Hopefully that makes sense. So we play knight d7. Bishop e3, we push e5, reaching kind of our target setup with these two pawns clamping down on the d4 square. And if I were playing white here, I would probably choose to carry out the f4 pawn break anyway. Who can tell me a nice way that white can prepare f4? Like, what is necessary in order for white to play f4? Where should the queen go is really what I'm asking. No, folks, come on. Bringing over the knight, is that necessary? The f4 square is already protected by the bishop, by the rook, potentially by the queen. So the best move is queen g3. You want to kind of step the queen over to the side onto a relatively invulnerable square. You see a lot of players, they play, for example, queen d1, but that move ruins the coordination between the rooks, and you want to keep the queen around, right? You just want to keep it on a square where it doesn't interfere. Queen g3 is the best move, castles, and white can safely push f4. Now here, what would black do? Well, for black, we already know some of the ideas. You guys can already generate a move based on what you know. Well, what do you know? Well, one thing that we already know is that the knight's ideal square is e6. So what move prepares the long knight maneuver? The fool's ghost got it. You deserve a sub. The best move, according to the engine, as I see here, is in fact rook e8. And this move should already make perfect sense to you. First of all, you're bringing the rook onto a better square, obviously, and you're controlling the e5 square. So you might play knight e5, but more likely, you'll play knight f8, knight e6, and knight d4, as is typical. Another move is queen b6 here, just trying to harass the pawn on b2, and of course exploiting the fact that white can't push b3 because he loses the knight. White has to play this awkward move, and now you can use the x-ray against white's king to play the move c4 check, trying to improve your queenside pawn structure. And if bishop b3, you can throw in the move bishop d4. Look how active black's pieces suddenly are. And here black has solved all of his problems, or her problems. Lax Enhancer asks, isn't rook e8 giving up some defense of the f4 pawn? Again and again and again, when you play an opening like the Sicilian, most moves in a complicated middle game are going to have some drawbacks. But to that, you should ask yourself, are you really worried about white winning the f7 pawn? Right? Defending something isn't an inherent good or an inherently bad thing. It's just a fact of the position. Not defending something doesn't, again, constitute a bad thing if that something cannot be effectively attacked. So you could say, well, okay, can white attack f7? Well, in order for white to attack f7, white's going to have to move their bishop out of f4. And after bishop e3, knight f8, you just calculate. Don't be afraid to calculate. Well, this drops the c5 pawn. So that doesn't really work, but let's throw in the move b6. And, okay, what if white plays queen f2? Is this dangerous? Can we not defend f7? No, we absolutely can. How should we defend the f7 pawn? Who can tell me? No. Don't go f6. Come on, guys. Don't go f6. Don't go knight e5. The knight is earmarked for f8 and e6. The best move is queen e7. Rook e7 is a little bit awkward. It's just, it blocks the queen. It sets up a potential pin. So now you can't play knight f8 because of bishop g5. So the most harmonious move is queen e7. Notice that the pawn on c6 here restricts the knight on c3, preventing knight d5, which is actually very important. Otherwise, knight d5 would be a problem. So look at how every kind of cog in the machine is important. You have to appreciate the placement of every piece and how it's impacting the position, what squares are important to control and what squares are not important to control. Okay, white can play bishop g5 even here, but you can just play, first of all, you can play queen e6. Second of all, I think tactically this move actually works. There. And you could play a move like bishop e5 and prepare queen g3. I mean, look at how weak the dark squares are around white's king. I think black has full compensation here. So anyways, we kind of went far there, but that's what I would do with white. Our opponent played, I wouldn't say aimlessly. I mean, our opponent played quite decently. a4, we met with a5. And our opponent decided to maneuver the knight to g3, which is actually a very impressive idea for this level, to prevent f5. And our idea stemmed from the fact that we want to play f5, so we bring our queen up to e6. White plays c3, and here we decided to take the plunge and play f5. Now, I'd like to point out that there actually wasn't really any hurry. I think in a classical game, I would err on the side of playing a move like b6 first, because there is no instant hurry to play f5. I exaggerated during the game, indicating that b4 is dangerous. b4 is actually not dangerous now that I look at it carefully, because it does a lot more harm than good. And after a takes b4, c takes b4, I want to point out an instructive idea. So here, for black, the best move is rook takes a4. And who can tell me the best move after b takes c5? This is an instructive move that you should come up with pretty instinctively. Yeah, so what you shouldn't do is play BC because your pawns are terrible. This is like the worst extra pawn in the world. Not to mention you'll probably lose it back. The best move is B5, right? Classic move, creating a protected passer, and this is the most well-protected pawn on the whole board. Meanwhile, white is the one who's got the weak pawn on C5. The bishop is tied down to it, and you could later attack it with queen E7. So this is like an important way to successfully resolve the tension on the queen side. It's better than playing c takes b4, which is also not bad. You could play like this. But if you play like this, you give the rook a nice square on c4, and you create for yourself a backward pawn on b6, which could be easily pressured by the other rook from b1. So if you just consider the ways to transform the queenside structure, rook a4 and b5 is by far the best. So I would have played b6, but we decided in the game to play more decisively with f5. The engine actually likes it. Takes, and bishop to d2, dropping the bishop back. So here we decided to move the queen into d5, which I think is a very reasonable move. Flamin' Cornbread asks an interesting question. Why not b5 to undouble the pawns? Well, the answer is simple. White's not going to take on b5, right? And you might say, well, then you take on a4. But again, it's the same logic as b takes c5 being bad. After b takes a4, yeah, you win a pawn technically, but look at the damage you're doing to your pawn structure. You're damaging your pawn structure permanently. So with white, I would play a move like knight h5 here. I would just ignore the possibility of ba. So don't assume that your opponent is going to cooperate in whatever you want to do. How do you determine in that position that you should aim for f5? Well, it's a stock plan. It's a typical plan in this position. And, well, the reason I'm able to see that f5 is good is because attacking the king side with your pawns is just inherently good, as well as the fact that it threatens f4. So it actually pushes white's minor pieces off of their squares. In the event of the move knight h5, I think we would have just driven the pawn into f4 anyway. And notice that I modify my play based on my opponent's move. Who can remind me why the move f4 is positionally bad in this situation? For example, in this and other similar situations. Why is f4 bad? Because of knight e4. Yeah, and this is a monster square. But it's a monster square only if it's occupied by a knight. But if white plays knight h5, then we can play f4, and the knight is excommunicated. It's out of commission. It's trapped, so probably white is going to end up trading it for the bishop. But now we are more than happy to give up the e4 square because there's nothing good that can occupy it. And furthermore, we could even push c4 on doubling our pawns. So b5 actually is the right idea, but c4 forces white to take on c4 or allow c takes d3, and there is nothing good to occupy e4. This is a very important concept, and it's never really too early to understand it. It's the notion that a weak square does not exist in a vacuum. I call it the notion of inaccessibility, right? It's like if a tree falls in the forest, did anybody hear it? If a weak square exists and there is no piece to occupy it with, then it's not even really a weak square, and you shouldn't be too worried about weakening it. So you should always ask yourself, like, can my opponent access the weak square? And can they do it in a timely fashion? And if the answer is no, very often you can make a move that would otherwise be totally unthinkable. And there's always a go-to example that I indicate in this case. And I've shown it during the speedrun before. But it's one of my favorite illustrations of this concept. And it's not a very well-known game. This is a game between two very strong GMs, as you can see. Sargsyan, Armenian GM. Tomaszewski is a Russian GM, 2013. And they reached the position that you see in front of you. So it's white to move, and the goal is to generate the best move. And the real goal is to gain a positional advantage for white. So I'll give you guys a moment to think about what black's main idea is. And if you've listened carefully to the theme, then the move should make perfect sense right at the outset. White to move. And if you're watching on YouTube, you should similarly pause and try to generate the move. Even if you're a beginner, you should still kind of understand this concept. So I would encourage everybody to try. White to move. And some of you may remember this position. I mean, I've shown it before, but it's worth showing again. So let's take a step back, and most of you are getting the move, and figure out the ideas for both sides, which are actually very simple. White's attacking on the queen side. So white is ready to engineer and carry out the b5 pawn break and create major weaknesses for black on the queen side. But black, of course, is threatening to push e5 and open up the center, exploiting eventually the weakness on e3. So, for example, if we were to push b5 prematurely, black would trade and play e5. And in the event of the trade, the knight would then jump to c4. And the attack on the e3 pawn would become very unpleasant. So Sargsyan plays the brilliant move f4. And it's brilliant because it's seemingly anti-positional. He closes down the bishop, but more importantly, he creates this gaping hole on e4. But of course, the key is that black cannot physically occupy the square with his knight. In order to do so, black needs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 moves to get there with his knight. And of course, the reason is that g5 is not accessible and d6 is not accessible. The two airports are closed. And in the time that black spends trying to get his knight there, white is already going to break through on the queen side a million times over, which is basically exactly what happened. Now, I'm not going to pretend that white is winning after f4, but it makes black's life incredibly difficult. So this concept of something, not a weak square not being accessible, is really important and often a reason to create that weakness in the first place. Yeah, black can and probably should have played g5. But after g5, we can ignore, and we can just play b5, right? Again, remember the concept of just ignoring your opponent's pawn play. You don't always have to engage them. gf, you play ef. And who does the opening of the e-file benefit? Well, it only benefits white because there's a weak pawn that's sitting on e6. This game ended... No, white won. White actually did win this game. So let's go back to the speedrun. That was a very long-winded explanation, I admit, but I think it's a very pertinent concept. We weaken e4 only because white no longer has a knight that can occupy it. And in this position, I think black is not worse. After dc, we can even consider pushing the other pawn with e4, and we've got a lot of prospects for our pieces. So in any case, bishop d2, queen d5, queen e2. So here we played the general kind of solidifying move, rook f7. Somewhere around here, I think objectively I got a worse position. I like our opponent's move c4. At first glance, I was very pessimistic about it. I thought it creates a big weakness on d4, but our opponent's idea was very concrete, and it was to improve the placement of his bishop and put pressure on the e5 pawn. So now we took a tempo to play b6. I think this is an important move, protecting the a5 pawn. Rook fe1, and we bring our rook to e8. So this part of the game is very logical, and then we get the next stage of the game after f4. So I don't think f4 is a mistake. I think white is still doing fine here. We played queen g6, sliding the queen to a better defensive square and attacking the knight. Queen f3 is another excellent move. We double our rooks on the e-file. And I actually think that this is still not a big mistake. I think that the main mistake by our opponent, the first serious mistake was to play this move knight e2, because it yields without a fight control of the e-file, and it lets us play queen e8 with tempo. And this is a big tempo move. It's still, I think, the position is equal with best defense, but it gets unpleasant here already. So in any case, I think probably if white wanted to play accurately, then in this position, white should have refrained from releasing the tension with f takes c5, because that really allowed us to, get rid of the problem of this passive knight, and we won the battle over the e-file. So probably white's best move is something like rook e2. This is an incredibly hard move. I mean, this is a grandmaster level move, because white's just trying to double on the e-file, and white's trying to win the damn battle over the e-file. But a lot of players would be worried about the look of the move e4, I think. Right? e4 looks a little scary, but if you calculate after fe4, d4, fe4, white actually has a beautiful tactical idea. It's a gorgeous tactical idea. I'll let you guys try to find it. White to play. Not f5. f5 doesn't work because after e takes f3, f takes g. So you have to take the queen, and then you give up the rook. But you're close. The correct sequence does involve the move f5. Now, if you think about it, what does the move f5 achieve? Well, it attacks black's queen. It also cuts off the connection between the queen and the e4 square. So think about what you can start with. The key is to eliminate the attack on white's queen. Then f5 is going to work. The move is knight takes e4. Yeah, very close. Rook takes e4 is also good, by the way, but knight e4 is even better. And the idea is to meet rook takes e4 with f5, and white is winning. Because the queen hangs, black can't get a lot for the queen, and if the queen moves, then there's no way to move the queen and simultaneously defend the rook. Black wins. White wins. Here, and white is up in exchange. So maybe beautiful was an overstatement, but still very, very nice idea. But you kind of would have to see that when playing rook e2. And if black plays e takes f4, then you can just play rook e7, queen f4, and you might say, well, but didn't white give up the e file here? Well, yes, but here there's the extenuating circumstance that the f5 pawn is now a massive weakness, and black might even have to get away from the e file to defend it. But this just shows you how beautiful positional chess is and how intertwined tactics are with strategy, right? There's a strategic plan here of controlling a file, but the way that you control it is you actually use these super complicated tactics. That's why positional chess is really hard. Now, a lot of you were asking me to analyze the move knight h5. Knight h5, I just did analyze. We looked at it just now, a couple of moves ago, and we determined that I would have played f4. Of course, there were other moments when white could have played the move knight h5. And not in all of those moments would we have responded with f4. Like, for example, if white plays knight h5 here, I'm already not... Well, I guess still f4. I still think f4 is very good to trap the knight and potentially prepare f3. Yeah, we would have still played f4. And even here, probably, we would have played f4. So this f4 mechanism was very strong, provided that the knight wouldn't be able to reach e4. So back we go to bishop e5, rook e5, rook e5. There was a beautiful tactic here that I had noticed, and it was in response to rook f1, which actually I think rook f1 was still the best move, and maybe the only remaining way to get equality. The move, as many of you indicated, is rook to e3. And the idea is queen takes e3, bishop d4. The game is not over. How should white proceed here? Well, white should give up the queen for the bishop and snag another pawn. White is rook, knight, and pawn for the queen, but in such an open position, the queen is able to, very often to infiltrate the opponent's camp, and I think black is winning here. Or at least black has good winning chances. But who can spot the brilliant counter move by white? The tactics aren't over here. White is a defense. I know some of you must be thinking knight takes f5, but that's not the move. I read people's mind. Knight f5 is not the move if you actually calculate. Queen c6 blunders the queen, still. Yeah, the move is actually queen takes f5, only move. Knight f5 is very creative, but a lot of people just kind of stop calculating here, assuming, oh, I win the queen back. But it's not enough to win the queen back, because black just goes king f7. If you take the rook with check, then you give up the piece that's attacking the queen. And if you take the queen, bishop d4 is even stronger, but the simple rook f1 and hg just wins the game on the spot. So that doesn't cut it. Queen takes f5. The idea is that the queen pays a visit to c8 with checkmate in the event that black takes on g3 with either piece. So black actually has to trade queens and win the pawn back. But I think this rook endgame, if white defends it carefully, is a draw. In fact, even if white doesn't defend it carefully, this is just a draw. Because the pawn endgame is losing for black because of the deep freeze. So black has to keep the rooks on the board, and now white's managed to kind of defend everything. So this, I think, was the narrow drawing line. But if our opponent had seen that, then I would have been a little bit suspicious. Knight e2, queen e8, knight f4, rook e3, and I already think that white is losing here. So people watching on YouTube and thinking that the game was anticlimactic, in fact, it's already like -3. And the reason is that the queen has no good squares. Queen f2 loses almost immediately because it aligns the king and the queen, allowing bishop d4, devastating move. and there's no way to stop all the discoveries. White loses the queen. Flamin' Cornbread is asking a question. Why not rook e1 check? Oh, why not rook e1 check takes here and here? Well, because queen takes c6. And I'm afraid that black will not be able to escape the perpetual. The king is too weak here. The queen has too many checks. So this just seemed way too drawish. And remember that we considered bishop e5, g3, and I also think this is maybe only slightly better for black. So rook e3 is definitely the move. White should have played queen f1. But here, we don't even really need to do anything specific. The computer stop move is actually just bishop to f6. And the idea is to maneuver the bishop to this beautiful square on g3, where it kind of maximally restricts white's position and sets up ideas of rook e1. So bishop f6 actually was incredibly strong here, and white is already essentially paralyzed. The knight has no squares. It is literally restricted by all of black's pieces. This is incredibly bad for white. Yeah, we can play bishop d4 also, but then white moves the king away. And while the bishop looks incredibly good on d4, it would be better placed on g3 because it would be doing a lot more specific things. So another grandmaster move, bishop to f6, h4, and g3. How do you know that you have time for this? Well, because white is out of moves. And the reason white is out of moves is because you control the only open file. That's the power of that. So, yeah, queen c6, a disappointing blunder for sure. And we won't analyze after this, but the main mistake actually was this knight e2, knight f4 maneuver. That's what lost white the game. That really was all that it was. It was like two knight moves on move 27 and 28. So if our opponent had played rook f1, the game would have still been relatively balanced. But that would involve finding this incredible tactic with queen f5. So one interesting kind of narrative that you saw in that game is that it's not like white, white's position deteriorated very, very quickly. But that's from a purely objective standpoint. If you reason practically, white made some inaccuracies earlier in the game that set him up for this. So for example, already fe was an inaccuracy. You could even argue that f4 was a pretty risky move that got the game very tactical. And it increased the probability that, stuff was going to go down and a mistake would essentially lose the game. And that is oftentimes the difference between open positions with an open center, positions with a closed center. Positions with a closed center, you don't really run the risk of losing the game if you make a small mistake or you put your piece on the wrong square. That's why some people prefer, to play closed positions because, there's less at stake with every mistake as opposed to wide open center positions with lots of tactics. So in any case, that was the game. It was a really rich positional game, even though it ended up being pretty short. So I feel like I talked a lot, but I hope you found it productive. And that's yet another entry in our speedrun, our opening themed speedrun. As we start encountering more principled openings, I think we're already starting to build our understanding of key typical positions. Remember that training middle games is actually an extension of training openings. You have to know key middle game ideas. That's why in this game, I put a big emphasis on explaining the logic behind DC and E5. And these are all moves that we're going to play again in the Rossolimo. But I'm pretty exhausted. That took a lot of my energy. I hope you can appreciate that. And I'm going to hit the sack. And thanks everybody for watching. Thanks for hanging out. And again, subscribing to the YouTube. It really helps keep the content going. That's how I make a living. So, so I would really appreciate it. And thanks everybody. See you tomorrow. Bye.